Standing down, but not sorry. Boris Johnson resigns as Prime Minister, although he accepts no blame for his own downfall.
I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
With loyal supporters and wife Carrie looking on, the speech brings to a close a torrid 2 days for the PM and his party. Or does it? Still, the controversy continues, with Mr Johnson pledging to stay on in number 10, a Prime Minister in name only, until the autumn, to the despair of his critics.
He should leave office at the earliest possible opportunity, and preferably today.
It will not be tenable for him to continue as a caretaker if he cannot fill the ministerial appointments he needs to.
The resignation fires the starting gun on what looks like a wide-open leadership race. We take a look at the runners and riders. And what are the voters to whom Boris Johnson promised so much and who rocketed him to victory only 3 years ago? The Downing Street drama is far from over. Tonight we have a PM without power, a Tory party in crisis, a country without clarity. So, what happens next?
From Downing Street, this is the ITV Evening News with Mary Nightingale.
Good evening from Downing Street, where today Boris Johnson finally and reluctantly resigned as Conservative Party leader. He was forced to give up what he called the greatest job in the world after his government went into free fall with more than 50 resignations. He will only step down as Prime Minister once a new leader is appointed. In his resignation speech here, there were no tears, no apparent emotion, and unusually for Mr Johnson, no jokes either. There was also no acceptance of any personal responsibility for his downfall. He blamed the herd mentality of Westminster for forcing him out. He described the series of scandals that he brought on his government as relentless sledging. His only regret? That he couldn't persuade his colleagues that they should stick with him. And even now, he's still desperately clinging on to power, insisting he will remain as Prime Minister until the autumn. In a moment, we'll look at what's next for the Conservatives, for the country, and all the reaction to today's momentous events. But first, here's our political editor, Robert Peston, on Boris Johnson's moment of truth.
When the famous lectern came out at 12:15, it meant, as usual, the worst news for the occupant of 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister. And when those who work there gathered to give him moral support, including today Boris Johnson's wife Carrie and baby Romy, there was no room for doubt. Boris Johnson would be resigning 3 years after he got the job he always wanted.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place.
So we don't yet know how long he'll remain as caretaker Prime Minister, and he didn't hide that he has no desire to go.
And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019.
The Prime Minister then listed what he sees as his achievements, taking the UK out of the EU, the COVID vaccination programme, with no mention of what's gone wrong, the law-breaking parties, the predatory behaviour of his last Deputy Chief Whip, the questions over who paid for gold wallpaper. He even accused Tory MPs who wanted to get rid of him as a herd.
In the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much and when we have such a vast mandate and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Though only a few hours before, just last night, the PM was arguing he was indispensable and vowed he'd not be pushed out by the avalanche of ministers resigning from his government and the sheer number of his MPs saying they'd lost confidence in him. But he could cling on no longer after a Chancellor of the Exchequer he'd appointed just on Tuesday said, "This is not sustainable and it will only get worse for you, Prime Minister, for the Conservative Party and most importantly, for the country. You must do the right thing and go now." And an Education Secretary, also in post for less than 2 days, said she would resign. But even though Johnson's critics seem to have got their way, they're anxious about how long it'll be till he's actually out the door.
I do think it is quite incredible, though, to suggest that he will remain as Prime Minister for another 3 to 4 months. I think the sooner he is out of number 10, and preferably that is today, the better.
And Labour says it'll seek a vote in Parliament to accelerate his departure.
Labour will step up in the national interest and bring a vote of no confidence, because we can't go on with this Prime Minister clinging on for months and months to come.
A former Tory Prime Minister, John Major, is also uneasy about Boris Johnson staying in Downing Street even for a few more weeks. He wrote, "For the overall well-being of the country, Mr Johnson shouldn't remain in Downing Street for any longer than necessary to effect the smooth transition of government." As for Boris Johnson's immediate predecessor, she made clear that whoever succeeds Boris Johnson must learn at least one important lesson.
Playing by the rules means following them not because you have to, but because you do so willingly, recognising that the damage from breaking them may not be direct or immediate, but it can be severe and lasting.
So who next? ITV News asked a new member of the caretaker cabinet if he'd be a candidate.
I've been in politics a long time. I got up this morning not imagining for a minute that I'd be back in cabinet, so I've learned to expect the unexpected. What I do want is somebody who embodies one nation values.
One nation is what he said he'd build.
Thank you all very much.
But a series of scandals, which some say stem from his character, have split his party, split the nation and caused his term in office to end in failure. Robert Peston, ITV News.
Well, as Robert mentioned, it's still far from clear exactly when Mr Johnson will leave Downing Street. He has indicated he wants to stay on as Prime Minister until October or November, but many fear he cannot be trusted and should go now, as our Deputy Political Editor Anushka Astana reports.
A few months ago, this felt like a moment.
In the name of God, go.
But in truth, it was still a rare voice on the Tory benches. Even when 148 MPs voted against him,
Parliamentary party does have confidence.
Boris Johnson stayed put. But the scandal surrounding his deputy, Chief Whip Chris Pincher, and what appeared to be another lie.
The Prime Minister did not immediately recall the conversation in late 2019.
Was just too much, and in came that avalanche of resignations. When the PM finally went, the reaction among Tories in Parliament tended to go like this.
I'm relieved that yesterday's madness has stopped and that we can have a period of stability, but I'm saddened, and the atmosphere in Parliament has been very depressed.
Am I relieved? Yes. By sort of midnight last night, I was very angry, because it was perfectly clear that he was going to have to resign, and frankly, if we hadn't had the events of the last 24 hours or so, I think that would have been better for his legacy. I think it would have been better for him.
And how do you think he's feeling right now?
I imagine he's feeling sick, because it's a tragedy for him personally.
I think he should resign as Prime Minister and as leader of the Conservative Party today. And I know there are colleagues with other views, and I respect those other views.
But at the start of the day, many felt the same way, irritated to find out Mr Johnson would stay as PM. Boris needs to go now, not in the autumn, messaged one minister who'd resigned. Another agreed. There is a strong feeling the PM cannot be trusted to behave properly, they said. A third said no way about him staying. But as the day moved on, the mood shifted to this. It's ebbed and flowed, but consensus seems to be let him stay. And there's no mechanism to push him out anyway.
The rules in the Constitution are he remains Prime Minister until the Conservative Party has elected a new leader of the party.
That is why conversations in Parliament's tea rooms have turned to speeding up this process. Sources tell me it is likely that the 1922 committee of Conservative backbenchers, who tend to meet upstairs, will now push for candidates to face a vote of MPs within 2 weeks or less. The two finalists will then go in front of party members, and I'm told that there is a proposal for that part of the process to be done so quickly that we have a new Prime Minister when MPs return here in September.
What will be Boris Johnson's legacy?
Well, the legacy will ultimately be for historians to decide in time, but the immediate legacy, I think, will be one of unfulfilled promise. Huge potential, but ultimately, I'm afraid, unable to persuade people to have trust in what he was saying.
Trust that a new Conservative leader will now have to rebuild. Anushka Astana, ITV News in Westminster.
And our political editor Robert Peston is here now. Robert, things are rarely straightforward, are they, with Boris Johnson?
And this is mildly.
And this is very far from the clean break that many of his colleagues had hoped for. Is there any chance that they could actually make him go before the autumn?
There's a chance. I mean, let's be absolutely clear, we're not going to have any idea of the timetable for the election of the new leader until Monday. I mean, talking to a very senior party organiser, he indicated to me that he thinks the most likely outcome is that we will now get 2 frenetic weeks in which MPs choose between competing candidates, and then the top 2 in that contest would go through to a ballot of party members over the summer, which means that we would have a new Prime Minister in September, but actually it could be shunted all this to September, which means we wouldn't have a new Prime Minister till November. Now, Sir John Major, a former Tory Prime Minister, mistrusts Boris Johnson so much, he's actually written to the sort of shop steward of the Tory party, Sir Graham Brady, and said, think about cutting out the party members and just allowing MPs to choose, which means we get a new Prime Minister, in just a couple of weeks' time. There's no chance of that happening. Tory members who fund the party, keep it going, would go nuts. So that's not going to happen. So I think he is going to be there for probably a couple of months as a minimum. And I have to say, I'm absolutely certain that he's going to be there in July. Why is that? Because he wants to use his Chequers grace and favour home, which he only gets from being Prime Minister, for a wedding party, and the invitations have already gone out. He's definitely not going to cancel that.
All right, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Amazing, isn't it? Well, keeping pace with the speed and volume of resignations over the past days has at times felt like a pretty impossible task. Nonetheless, many of the vacancies have indeed been filled. James Cleverly is Education Secretary. Greg Clark is Levelling Up Secretary. And Kit Malthouse is Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, replacing, of course, Michael Gove, who was sacked last night. Robert Buckland is now Welsh Secretary. Shailesh Vara is Northern Ireland Secretary. And Andrew Stevenson has been appointed Minister without portfolio. But despite these appointments, there are still dozens of junior positions waiting to be filled. And that could all change again when the next Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister is appointed, of course. The process for that has already started, as Robert said, and some candidates have already put their names in the hat. Our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan, looks at the likely runners.
This is a race with many potential contenders. The front runners from within the current cabinet are probably Liz Truss, Nadhim Zahawi and, out in front, Ben Wallace. His handling of the Ukraine crisis has made the Defence Secretary the clear favourite amongst party members. But this morning he was tight-lipped on the subject of leadership.
Let's see what the Prime Minister says. He's still the Prime Minister. He's going to make a statement at 12:30, and after that statement then be happy to talk to people.
Then there's Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid, who resigned so dramatically on Tuesday. Rishi Sunak's star has fallen from once giddy heights, but he is still a contender. The question is whether members forgive him for triggering the Prime Minister's downfall.
I suspect that Nadhim Zahawi, Liz Truss, other people who didn't resign were thinking that they're going to try and woo those voters. It will hurt Rishi that he did quit. Whether or not he can overcome that with other supporters remains to be seen.
Less well known are Trade Minister Penny Mordaunt and Brexit-backing Attorney General Suella Braverman, who declared her candidacy before there was a vacancy last night on Peston.
If there is a leadership contest, I will put my name into the ring.
And Mordaunt, a former Defence Secretary, is surprisingly popular for a junior minister.
Penny Mordaunt is leading the polls. I think she'd be terrific. I think that we'll see who else puts their hat in the ring.
And from the backbenches, Jeremy Hunt, Steve Baker and Tom Tugendhat are all spoken of.
Who do you think would be the best person to lead the party?
I think Jeremy Hunt, if and when he declares, will be an absolutely fantastic candidate and a very, very strong one.
Steve Baker is best known for organising effective backbench campaigns.
I have led sometimes up to a third of Tory MPs through the worst crises we've faced. I have to take seriously, therefore, suggestions to me that I should stand from my supporters.
It will not take long to find out who wants to stand. The exact rules for the contest aren't yet set, but broadly speaking, all the candidates will face a series of runoff votes amongst Tory MPs here in Parliament. At each stage, the one with the lowest number of votes is eliminated. Once they get down to the final two, they will then tour the country, trying to appeal to Tory party members. But before all that, the Backbench 1922 committee must decide how many backers each candidate needs to get onto the ballot. Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Westminster.
Well, many of the potential leadership candidates will be at a party in Westminster tonight, hosted by the weekly political magazine, The Spectator. And our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks, is there for us tonight. Romilly, what's going on? I imagine the atmosphere is quite lively, is it?
Oh, it certainly is. Tory MPs, aides and grandees have already started trooping through that artfully decorated door behind me here. We've just seen David Davis, Liam Fox and Sir Graham Brady, who's going to be so key to the next stage of this process, go in. And it's here tonight, as the champagne starts to flow, that the plotting and the lobbying over who's going to replace Boris Johnson will get started in earnest. On my way here, I met the backbencher Alex Shelbrooke, who told me he's started work on Liz Truss's leadership campaign. I understand Rishi Sunak, another key contender, has set up a campaign headquarters already. And Penny Mordaunt, who, as Carl was saying, is polling well amongst members, has been holding regular meetings with backbench MPs. The field is absolutely wide open at the moment, and as we know from previous experience with these contests, it's often not the front runner who makes it to the end.
OK, Romilly Weeks at the Spectator Party in Westminster. Thank you. Well, there's plenty more still to come on the ITV Evening News, including a look at how voters in the infamous Red Wall feel about the demise of the PM they helped to put in Downing Street.
I think we'll all be glad to see the back of him.
He's done a very good job, and it's just a shame to see him go. He's being stabbed in the back.
Plus the view from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, each with their own very pressing issues that a new Prime Minister is going to have to resolve. We will be back after the break. Do join us then. Welcome back to Downing Street. Now, one of Boris Johnson's biggest electoral successes was in last year's by-election in Hartlepool. There, the Conservatives set a post-war record when they overturned a huge Labour majority in a stunning victory. Brexit was a key part of that, but so too was the appeal of Mr Johnson himself. So how do voters there feel now? And our social affairs correspondent Sarah Corker found out.
This is where the Conservatives sailed to one of their most historic victories. Last year's by-election win here in Hartlepool marked a high point in Boris Johnson's popularity. Since then, his supporters ebbed away.
He's limped on for all this time, completely selfishly. And I think we'll all be glad to see the back of him.
I think we just need somebody to work together
and help us get out of this rut that we're all in now.
You want another general election?
General election. Let the people have the vote, see what to say. It's a sociopath that won't go. That's my opinion of the man.
Rewind to May 2021. Boris Johnson was here celebrating Hartlepool turning blue for the first time in nearly 50 years.
It's a mandate for us to continue to deliver.
The elbow pumps and inflatables are a world away from today's political reality.
We're no further forward with the Tories.
This business owner is utterly fed up with all the political parties.
Has life improved for people in Hartlepool? No, it definitely hasn't. And you can take a look by the amount of food banks that we have in the town. People are still struggling. We're a dead-end little town that's not really got a lot going for us. So at the moment, we just really need some support.
Others, like Philip, the taxi driver, completely disagree.
Everything's been hard, but it's not Boris Johnson's fault. All fuel's gone up, everything's gone up. But he's still doing his best to get us out of it. I think he's doing a very good job, and it's just a shame to see him go. He's being stabbed in the back.
This is an area that has been hit hard by the rising cost of living. They've been promised so much under the levelling up agenda, and many of those here who voted Conservative for the very first time last year now feel let down. Down the coast in Redcar today, it felt like these Tories were in an alternative universe, trying to talk up new investment just as their leader resigned. But the strain was starting to show.
I'm concentrating on delivering jobs and investment for Teesside, and there's a wonderful contrast there, isn't there? The debacle that's going on in Westminster now as a result of the Prime Minister's resignation, paired with the start of manufacturing, the start of construction.
After another turbulent day, the question now turns to whether the Conservatives can shore up their support in places like this with a different leader at the helm. Boris Johnson won over traditional Labour areas, was his promise to get Brexit done and to level up, a popular message in parts of the north of England. And we did find some loyalists here today, but many people are still deeply angry and frustrated by a government they say has barely functioned in recent weeks. The Tory MP here, Jill Mortimer, she said new leadership is needed and a refocusing on the issues that matter to ordinary people. And remember, we're 200 miles away from Westminster here, and some communities feel that they're still being overlooked and ignored by those in power.
Thank you. And let's hear reaction from across the nations tonight. Our Scotland reporter Louise Scott is in Glasgow. UTV's political correspondent Vicky Hawthorne is in Belfast. And our Wales reporter Rhys Williams is in Cardiff. Turning to you first of all, Louise. Scotland's First Minister has been pretty scathing, hasn't she, about Mr Johnson's plan to stay on as Prime Minister for the time being?
Is it this one that's worst?
Yeah.
Is it this light? Is it this light that's hard?
OK, we don't seem to have Louise Scott's audio there. I'm sorry about that. So let's go to Vicky Hawthorne now in Belfast. Vicky.
I think he should stay on. Yes, Mary, similar views being expressed here in Northern Ireland to what we understand is being expressed in Scotland. Some political leaders here firmly saying that Boris Johnson should go now, that he should not remain as Prime Minister until the autumn. Sinn Féin, the largest political party in Northern Ireland, firm supporters of a united Ireland. They are certainly not sorry to see Boris Johnson go. They've never liked him or his policies, whereas the Democratic Unionist Party, the largest unionist party here, they've very much been relying on Boris Johnson to fix the Northern Ireland Protocol for them, those post-Brexit trading arrangements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which unionists say is damaging Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. And the DUP is refusing to go back into the devolved assembly at Stormont until that is sorted. Boris Johnson has been pushing legislation through Parliament to do just that, and the DUP will want any new Prime Minister to show the same commitment as Boris Johnson has on that.
Well, Wales doesn't have those same urgent constitutional issues we've just been hearing about from Vicky, but what definitely has happened over the last couple of years in particular is that the relationship between Westminster and Cardiff Bay has grown increasingly fractious, with the Labour First Minister Mark Drakeford falling out repeatedly with Boris Johnson, particularly over the pandemic. And what Mr Drakeford has told ITV News tonight is that he hopes whoever becomes Prime Minister next treats the Senedd with some more respect and not, as he described it, like a subordinate parliament. There's a new Secretary of State for Wales as well after Simon Hart resigned last night. I understand that no Conservative MPs with Welsh constituencies were willing to do the job, with a number of them ruling themselves out. It's gone to Sir Robert Buckland, the former Justice Minister and South Swindon MP, though he was born and raised in Llanelli. He says he only took the job because Boris Johnson was going to resign. The big question now for the Welsh Conservatives is how do they hold on to those seats like Wrexham, Bridgend and Daylin that they won for the very first time ever under Boris Johnson back in 2019.
OK, Rhys, thank you for the moment. And let's try Louise Scott again in Glasgow. Louise, I don't know if you heard me first time, but I was asking about Nicola Sturgeon's response. She's been quite scathing, hasn't she, about Mr Johnson's plan to stay on as Prime Minister?
She certainly has. She says it would cause chaos if Boris Johnson stays on, saying he's lost the confidence of not just his party and the House of Commons, but of the whole of the UK, adding she doesn't believe he's genuinely capable of behaving as caretaker Prime Minister. Now, of course, when talking about a replacement Prime Minister, she was keen to point out that Scotland hadn't voted for the Conservatives to be in power. To put that into perspective, there's currently 45 SNP MPs and only 6 Scottish Conservatives. But the current Prime Minister, he bolsters support for independence up here, so we're not quite sure what the SNP will be hoping for next. One final point of interest, the Scottish Conservative leader here, Douglas Ross, he echoed the First Minister's calls for the Prime Minister to go. He believes there should be an interim leader in place, but he has ruled himself out of that top job.
OK, Louise Scott, we got there in the end in Glasgow. Thank you. Vicky Hawthorne in Belfast and Rhys Williams in Cardiff. Now, Boris Johnson's assistant has told ITV News the Prime Minister was planning to announce tax cuts next week to try to win back support. And the next Prime Minister may indeed want to follow a similar path. But the government's own economic forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, has published analysis today which shows that that may well be difficult. And our economics editor, Joel Hills, is here. Joel, explain, what are the OBR's concerns exactly?
Well, look, the Conservative Party was elected in 2019 on a manifesto pledge to balance the books and get debt falling. And these things matter very greatly. Back in March, you may remember that the Office for Budget Responsibility estimated that the Chancellor back then was on course to meet his fiscal rules with about £30 billion to spend. So whoever the next Prime Minister installs at number 11 will have to honour these manifesto pledges. And the OBR points out this morning that this £30 billion has been rapidly disappearing because of the worsening economic outlook.
All right.
It's at risk from high energy prices, it's at risk from rising interest rates, and it's also at risk from the fact that inflation's putting pressure on departmental budgets. It's putting pressure on pay, which will erode the nominal value of those budgets, which you have to remember was set back in October when we thought inflation was going to be closer to 4% rather than the double digits that the Bank of England is now forecasting.
So there's real concern, isn't there?
Yeah, this disappearing £30 billion of headroom matters because in the next few weeks we may see some candidates offering tax cuts, perhaps significant ones, as part of their pitch to be the next Tory leader. What the OBR's analysis today is showing that significant tax cuts are going to be very difficult to make without also cutting spending. In fact, it's their assessment that the public finances today are only in a good position because of the tax rises that Rishi Sunak introduced in the wake of the pandemic.
All right, Joel Hills, thank you. And there is still much more to come before Emmerdale here on the ITV Evening News on the day that Boris Johnson was forced to resign.
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
We've already heard about some of the names in the frame to become the next Tory leader and Prime Minister. And next we'll be looking back at the rise and the fall of Boris Johnson, tracing his very singular political career from its start to today.
The decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful.
And we're also going to be speaking to the senior backbencher Theresa Villiers about what happens next in the race to replace him as Prime Minister. And in other news, Northern Ireland's women prepare for their first ever match in the finals of a major tournament.
And join me later in the programme where I will of course have the full national forecast and news of more sunnier skies on the way.
But before all that, the Boris Johnson era may not quite be over yet, but in his resignation speech here, the Prime Minister outlined what he wants his legacy to be. Delivering Brexit, the COVID vaccine rollout, ending lockdown early, and Britain's support for Ukraine. Others, though, might point to the damage they feel that he has done to the country, jeopardising the union, undermining public trust, upsetting the Queen, even breaking the law. It was his character which made him popular, not just with Conservative voters, even traditional Labour ones too. But ultimately, it also perhaps led to his downfall, as our UK editor Paul Brand reports.
He's a politician who's often appeared to defy gravity.
Can you get me a rope?
So how did Boris Johnson reach the end of the line? On first name terms with the voters, perhaps it was his familiarity, which made his stumbles his strength.
It's a beautiful day, there's a beautiful river, and what could be more lovely on a day like this than have a quick informal dip.
As the first and only Conservative Mayor of London, there was almost nothing and no one he wouldn't tackle in the name of a good photo. The usual rules of engagement simply didn't apply.
And I hereby declare that the said Boris Johnson is duly elected.
Taking his personality to Parliament, it would be deployed on one of the biggest campaigns of our time.
The bastion of independence.
Charming voters to leave the EU with unconventional powers of persuasion.
Admit that figure is grotesquely misleading at best.
I won't.
Victory in the Brexit referendum would be his first of several, but not immediately. The crown passed to Theresa May, but even beside her, Boris Johnson became a thorn in it. Eventually, he would replace her to begin a premiership often unprecedented. With gridlock over Brexit, Boris Johnson used his usual tactics to bulldoze it, triggering an election. Like never before, his character was called into question.
Can you look at me in the eye and tell me that you haven't lied in your political career?
Absolutely not. And
Never
I've never tried to deceive the public.
But again, his personality came with a premium. A landslide victory was his.
This morning I went to Buckingham Palace and I am forming a new government.
But charisma was not enough in a crisis. COVID-19 required a new seriousness.
You must stay at home.
But catching the virus himself, spending 3 days in intensive care, did not add caution to his character. Accused of making mistakes, this would be his most damaging.
His fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
The laughs and jokes about parties during lockdown revealed by ITV News suggested his premiership lacked principle. He was no longer forgiven, but fined for being a rule breaker.
I paid the fine immediately, and I offered the British people a full apology.
But having blustered his way through, strength had turned weakness, and questions of character recurred.
You made the rules as Prime Minister, so it does beg the question, are you a liar?
Well, Paul, I think you've... no.
His MPs temporarily forgave him, at least enough of them.
I can announce that the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
But allegations of more untruths surrounding the behaviour of his Deputy Chief Whip proved to his party that asset had become liability.
I think it was a mistake, and I apologise for it.
In the end, Boris Johnson proved in politics you can evade the rules, but not the truth. And tonight, he's had to face up to it. Paul Brand, ITV News.
OK, well, let's get more reaction to the Prime Minister's downfall now. And our Deputy Political Editor, Anushka Astana, is in Westminster with senior Conservative backbencher Theresa Villiers. Anushka.
That's right. Theresa Villiers is the Conservative MP for Chipping Barnet in North London, and she's seen a lot. She's been an MP since 2005. She's been Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and for Environment. And Theresa, you saw the downfall of David Cameron, you saw the downfall of Theresa May, but in many ways this is a bigger fall from grace, given that huge majority in 2019. What went wrong and how does today feel?
Well, I think we're sort of thinking, how did we come to this? I'm afraid we had some disastrous local election results and then even worse by-election results, and many people were on the doorstep expressing their real dissatisfaction with the Prime Minister, particularly in relation to Partygate. And then the events relating to Chris Pincher just made the Prime Minister's position untenable.
But you look almost shell-shocked?
I think shell-shocked is the right way to describe it. I mean, the removal of a sitting Prime Minister is a huge step. I, to be honest, very much hoped that we could avoid it, but unfortunately, many people, their trust in the Prime Minister's judgment had been lost. And we now need to rebuild that as Conservatives.
And I will ask you about that, but just do you think he should stay on as Prime Minister? And has he offered you a job? Would you take one?
He hasn't, and I probably wouldn't, but I think his staying on as a caretaker at the top of government is a pragmatic solution. That's what's been done in the past in relation to David Cameron and Theresa May.
So you're okay. And obviously, let's talk about what comes next. He lost a huge amount of support in London, including in seats like yours. Who of the leadership candidates can rebuild that trust? What does the Conservative Party need now?
We need some fresh ideas on how we grow the economy so that we can give further help with the cost of living and get people's taxes down. So that is one of the things I will be looking for in the candidates.
So you haven't decided yet?
No, I'm afraid I've learned from bitter experience of these contests that rushing to support a particular candidate at an early stage is often unwise.
Why?
Well, very often the early success stories crash and burn. So I will be meeting all the candidates and listening carefully to whether they're going to deliver for my constituents in Chipping Barnet.
Does it matter if they supported Brexit or Remain?
I think their commitment to delivering on our Brexit freedoms is important. So if they voted Remain, we need to be sure they'll go ahead, for example, with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill.
And just quickly, does it matter if they stood by Boris Johnson till the bitter end? Does it matter if they, for example, like Nadine Zahawi, took a new job right at the end? Does it help if they went?
I think people who stayed with the Prime Minister to the end and those who realised that his time was up at an earlier stage, I think both categories will be considered very seriously for the leadership.
So keeping tight-lipped for now. Mary.
All right, Anushka, thanks very much for that. And Robert's still here. Now, Robert, Theresa Villiers, you were just listening to, was one of the loyalists who always supported Boris Johnson, didn't she? But she did indeed call for him to go. What kind of candidate do you think is going to come next?
So the big difference this time from 2019 was that in the 2019 leadership election, Boris Johnson had been campaigning for months from the backbenchers, and his reputation as a winner in the London mayor elections means he was the red-hot favourite. There is, astonishingly, nobody at the moment who you could class as a favourite. Now, there's a website called Conhome that polls Tory members. They like Ben Wallace more than other members, senior members of the party. It's not at all clear that the Defence Secretary is even going to run. Somebody else they like is Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. But when I talk to Tory MPs, they're not 100% sure that she'll even make it into the last two that the Conservative members actually choose between, because the initial choice is made by Tory MPs. Now, my guess is that there will be, in the final runoff, one nation centrist, probably a Remainer, and one Brexiter who will go to the final runoff. But right now, I honestly would be a fool to tell you which of those the various candidates will end up on that shortlist of two.
And Brexit's still the issue.
It's
Amazing,
still a huge issue, as we heard from Theresa Villiers.
Yeah. All right, for the moment, Robert, thank you. And let's look at some other news now. And the mother of baby Peter Connolly has been released from prison. Tracy Connolly was jailed for a minimum of 5 years back in 2009 for causing or allowing the death of her tortured 17-month-old son, Peter. Ministers tried to block her release, but it was refused by judges. The veteran Hollywood star James Caan, who starred in the Godfather films, has died at the age of 82. The American actor was Oscar-nominated in 1973 for his performance as Sonny Corleone. And a planned strike by British Airways check-in staff at Heathrow Airport has been suspended after the company made an improved pay offer. Around 700 staff are going to be balloted on the new deal. Let's move on to the Women's Euros now. Northern Ireland are about to play their first ever match at a major finals. They take on Norway in Southampton tonight. And the squad received some great news this morning with their captain Marissa Callaghan ruled fit. Well, Ruth Gorman is at St Mary's Stadium in Southampton for us tonight. Now, Ruth, they are the lowest ranked of the teams, but they have high hopes. Is that right?
They certainly do, and that is exactly why they are here today. Northern Ireland are currently 47th in the world rankings. The other 15 teams competing here at this tournament are the top 15 sides in Europe. The achievement of qualifying for these finals is nothing short of phenomenal. When Kenny Shields took over this side 3 years ago, he changed their mindset. They now go into every game believing they can win it. In fact, they only lost 2 out of 8 games en route to qualifying for these finals. His mantra is fear of failure is failure. So they'll come into these finals not scared of anyone, especially Norway, who actually beat them 6-0 the last time these sides met. But no fear in this side. They're calm coming into their first major tournament, and that's despite having a team made up of mostly part-time players. 13 play in the local league back home, only 2 play in England's Super League. So a big ask for this side, but their main aim is to continue to inspire the next generation, and they have done that. They've changed women's football back home forever. They rewrote the history books by tearing up the script and qualifying for these finals. Now it's time for Northern Ireland to show the world why they deserve to be here.
Ruth Gorman in Southampton, thank you very much. Just a few minutes to Emmerdale now and a break from all today's politics. But first, we'll have just one last chat with Robert about today's historic events and the new questions they raise for the future.
And I'm beside the Thames in Windsor, where it's been a lovely day. I have the forecast for tomorrow and the weekend.
And that's all coming up in just a moment, and I will be right back with Robert after this short break. Stay with us. Hello again, welcome back. Now, away from the whirlwind in Downing Street here today, it's actually been gloriously warm and sunny, and it's going to get hotter for many of us over the next few days. Alex is in Windsor tonight with the latest forecast. Alex.
Good evening to you, Mary. Yes, we are on the Thames in Windsor, and as you can see behind me, there is not a cloud in the sky. Actually, in stark contrast to here this morning, and for many of us, we woke up to grey skies. But as I said yesterday on the programme, it will break up as we head through into the afternoon, and boy, has it done. Earlier today, we were soaking up the atmosphere here in Windsor, and I can tell you that people are having a lovely time along the river, on the water, in the water. The swans were absolutely soaking up the vitamin D, and it's going to be staying pretty decent as we head through the next few days as well. We've been talking about temperatures rising. We're going to get a bit of a boost in temperature towards the end of the week, where we could see temperatures maybe hitting around, say, 30, 31 degrees Celsius as we get towards the weekend into Monday. We'll have to keep a watchful eye on that and see how it all starts to pan out. But it's certainly been a lovely day for many parts of the UK today. We saw a top temperature of 26.5 degrees at Kew Garden, not too far away from here, and we saw 25 in Northumberland as well. So that heat is starting to head its way northward. Right, let's take a look at the details then for the next couple of days.
With sizzling temperatures, there's a chance this feel-good weather will continue. Heinz Beans Burgers sponsors ITV National Weather.
Well, the highlights in the weather are certainly settled conditions, some decent sunshine as we head through the next few days into next week. And as I say, those temperatures will start to build. In fact, we can take a look at the air mass and jet stream chart now, and that really explains it. You can see the jet stream has meandered its way to the north of the UK, so that's why it's going to allow that warm continental air to feed up from the far south. We're also going to have high pressure sticking around into next week. So as I say, settled conditions, light winds and some decent sunshine. And you've guessed it, yes, it stays very fine as we head through this evening in many areas. In fact, if you take a look at this evening, you can see it stays pretty clear across many southern parts of the UK. Further north, though, into, say, Scotland and Northern Ireland, there's a touch more cloud, and this is why temperatures here will be protected by kind of a blanketed cloud cover, so they'll actually be held up at around 14 degrees Celsius. So a milder night to come here, slightly cooler as we come further south. But as we start tomorrow morning, it's going to be a pretty fine day for many areas, even across the north, where it's been a little iffy over the last few days. We'll start to see the sunshine breaking through. Temperatures may be a bit cooler tomorrow, but still very respectable. We should see highs in the north just touching 20, 21 degrees Celsius, but further south, we should see a high of 28 degrees Celsius as we head into Saturday. Again, it's really a repeat performance. Temperatures fall down by a degree or so in places, but they start to rise as we head into next week. As I say, maybe 31 by Monday.
Heinz Beans Burgers sponsors ITV National Weather.
Well, as you can see, it is picture perfect here. A fine evening on the cars, but do bear in mind, even at this time of year, or this time of the day rather, the UV levels are still fairly high. Back to you, Mary.
All right, Alex, thank you very much indeed. We end with more on today's events here in Downing Street. And if you listen carefully, I think you can hear a military band playing in Horse Guards Parade just over the wall there. Nothing, I'm told, to do with the Prime Minister resigning today. He's going to stay in office, though, until a successor is found. Robert is still here, and you watched it all unfold today. Final thoughts?
So, look, the country has changed very fundamentally on Boris Johnson's watch. We're out of the European Union, but we're still rowing with the European Union. Some would say the Prime Minister didn't protect us enough from the early and devastating COVID waves, but he did roll out a vaccination programme that is protecting millions of us in subsequent waves. The economy recovered pretty quickly after COVID, but we've now got the lowest growth in the world, the most squeezed living standards, and inflation is rising fast. And perhaps more pertinently to him, and what people say is his lack of scruples, trust in politics and political institutions is at a pretty low ebb. So I suppose the big question is, how much of the good and the bad is down to the occupant of that place, Boris Johnson? We've got a couple of months till he goes, probably, to make that judgment.
All right, Robert, thank you. And that brings to an end our programme on a momentous day here in Downing Street. Boris Johnson finally resigned as Conservative Party leader, firing the starting gun on the race to choose the next Prime Minister. In his reluctant resignation speech, watched by his wife carrying their baby Romy, Mr Johnson showed no regrets or apparent remorse. He made clear that he's the one responsible for the Conservative success at the last election, and he still believes, he says, that he should be the one to deliver on it. His slogan, "Get Brexit Done," chimed with many voters and fellow Conservative MPs. But when it's his own time, it seemed he couldn't quite accept it. And tonight, it's still not clear exactly when he and his family will be moving out. But the man who delivered Brexit is himself now going after being told that leave really does mean leave. From me and all the team here in Downing Street, bye-bye.